Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey, Adapters. Welcome back to another exciting episode. Joining me is Abrahm Lustgarten, an investigative climate reporter with Propublica. Abrahm has written a new book, On the Move, which focuses on migration, primarily in the U.S., that's likely to occur as the climate changes. The book focuses on climate-related topics like sea level rise, agriculture, wildfire, and water scarcity. He traveled the country learning how areas are preparing, or not, for the impacts of climate change. He goes on the ground and interviews people in the heart of these climate impact zones. You'll learn the unique struggles people have as it becomes increasingly expensive and dangerous to live in these impact zones. We also discuss how the media is doing covering climate migration and what the government can potentially do to help with this growing threat. It was a great conversation with a prestigious climate reporter focusing on an issue that will only become increasingly important. I also have a new item for the podcast, a hot take, which I'll share at the end of the episode. All right, let's dig into climate migration with Abrahm Lustgarten. Hey, Adapters, I've got an exciting episode for you. Joining me is Abrahm Lustgarten. Abrahm is an investigative reporter, public speaker on climate change, and author of On the Move, a new book about America's great climate migration. Hi, Abrahm. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
First off, congratulations on the book, but let's get people grounded first. So you work as a reporter at Propublica, correct? And can you tell us a little bit about that? What is that, and what do you do there?
Yeah, I'm a climate reporter at Propublica. We're a nonprofit investigative newsroom. And since about 2008, we've been focused on deep dive reporting projects with a strong accountability focus.
So we're going to talk a bit about your book here, but can you give us a flavor of some of the type of stories maybe you've covered over the last 5-8 years? Nothing too ancient, but just things that maybe in the immediate past.
Yeah, I've covered climate and environment from the start, written a series that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize about water scarcity in the American West and the management of the Colorado River. I've covered fracking extensively and from the beginning, and written about the oil industry extensively, and also written a lot about the loss and damage negotiations globally around climate change, how that's affecting vulnerable countries in the Caribbean and places like that.
We're going to just dive into your book, and I think maybe we can bring it back to some of those other topics. I've been reading a bunch of your articles and such, and fantastic writing, really enjoyed it. And so the book itself is On the Move, and it's currently available, right?
It is. It's out as of late March.
Fantastic. And let's get the basics here. What inspired you to write a book? You do a lot of long-form journalism, but a book is much longer than long-form journalism in a sense. Why a book?
Oh, I'm a geek for detail and nuance, and those are the kinds of things that magazine editors like to pull out of stories because they get too long. And so in this case, I started looking at climate-driven migration as a project with the New York Times back in 2018. And it was a series of stories. It was 3 cover stories in the New York Times Magazine. And despite those 3 lengthy stories, when I was finished with it, I felt like there was so much more to say about this issue, and in particular, so much more to think about how climate and migration were going to really change what the United States looked like. And a book is a form without bounds, and where I have a lot more creative flexibility, and I can make my own rules and basically explore the data and the research to the extent that I felt like was warranted.
And what I like, too, is that you do have this comprehensive, and it's the focuses on the United States. There's been a lot of articles about, okay, this region's going to have to move to that region, but this cohesive way of looking at the whole country, I certainly appreciated that. And I'm sure that allowed you to think deeply about this issue, right?
Yeah, I'm a very visual person. And so the first thing I wanted to do was try to map all these threats that we bat around in conversation. It's getting hotter, it's wildfires or battering California and so on. I wanted to get really granular, and I wanted to see what those would look like if we mapped them. And if we overlapped all those maps, what would that say about what places were safe or untouched? And so that's basically what I did. That's the premise of the book. I worked closely with the Rhodium Group, the economic and environmental research firm, and they had projections for these various types of data at the county level across the United States. And I took that data and mapped it and created this, what amounts to an image of the country with walls closing in around it, as I describe it in the book. And that's wildfires coming from the west and the southeast, and sea level rise on the coasts, and incredible heat and humidity piercing up through the middle. And it gives you the sense, I think, when you look at it visually, geographically, of movement towards a relief zone, if you will. And the map says that relief zone is in the north, the northern Midwest, and the Great Lakes, and the Northeast.
It's just exactly where I don't want to move, but I get it. And I want to come back to some of the climate data. I'm going to come back with a question related to that. And you answered actually 3 out of the 4. And I think I read this in a review. I don't think these are your words, but I like how they phrase this, that you are looking at 4 climate forces in this book. And you just identified 3 of them. Could you name the 4th? You know what, like you said, sea level rise and extreme heat, but the 4th is...
Yeah, I think there's more than 4. I mean, I looked at wildfire risk and sea level rise and rising temperatures and declining crop yields in agricultural productivity, and then increases in humidity and wet bulb temperatures.
Yeah, right. And so the droughts in agricultural land was the one I was getting at. And I thought that was really interesting. So a theme in your book also is winners and losers. And what do you mean by that? Doesn't everyone have to move? We're going to have winners and losers?
Yeah, not everyone has to move. And not only that, but not everybody will be able to move. And it's part of the equation when we talk about climate displacement and climate migration. There's the whole story of who will have to move and what that means for them and what it means for the places that they go. But a lesser discussed part of that story is who can't move, who's trapped in the places where they remain, and what happens to those communities that remain. And that's really a double-edged sword. And there's policy implications on both ends, and there's a lot to do on both ends. What that looks like roughly is maybe growth and opportunity in receiving communities, or at least challenges to accept people in receiving communities, but the risk of an economic spiral of decline in communities where people depart from, because almost certainly places will not empty out entirely. So it's a question of who is left behind. And the data suggests that it'll be disproportionately the poor and the elderly, and that those people in those communities will have increasing challenges in supporting a tax base that keeps their community vibrant, and that there is a risk of a spiral of decline then. And that's a trend that's going to take some real assertive energy and effort to counteract.
Was there any region, and I think of the flip side of that, and I'm from Florida originally, that can't afford to move? There's this implication that things will be so bad that people who can afford to move are going to do it. But there are, let's say, air conditioning allows us to stay in areas that maybe are just too hot. Could you see that sort of the reverse, that there might be just clusters of just very rich people staying in areas that they shouldn't be staying in? Did that ever come out in some of the modeling?
Yeah, so modeling isn't clear about who will move and where, but modeling is more clear about what are the pressures that are traditionally connected with migration and that will force people to be making these sorts of decisions. And the patterns of migration they're noisy and they're contradictory and they're very complicated. But generally, the wealthy will be no big surprise, the most resilient, and they'll be resilient in a couple of ways. They could afford to move. They're the most mobile, but they can afford to stay and defend themselves too, perhaps until the last moment. The models would suggest that it's the middle class and upper middle class that's most likely to move because they'll have the energy, maybe their younger families, maybe face that economic imperative to protect themselves or their assets by moving. And then poor and, as I said, aged communities are less likely to move. They'll be the least mobile because mobility is a factor of wealth. And then you bring into that equation the question of sort of technology and creature comforts and air conditioning, as you suggest. And that's complicated too, right? In the southern United States, we're going to see an increasing reliance on air conditioning, both in homes, but hopefully in indoor workplaces, in factories that maybe haven't had air conditioning and cooling yet. That air conditioning will make things more comfortable and more habitable, but it'll also make energy more expensive. And it will increase the cost of living, monthly cash flow cost of living for families in those regions affected. And that's one of those sort of countervailing forces that makes it a little less economically habitable to live in an extraordinarily hot climate if you don't have the means to have a well-insulated home and good cooling equipment and then to pay those energy bills.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I think I've read in maybe some of the articles, I'm not sure so much in the book, but looking at the Rust Belt and people fleeing that region because there were no jobs and such. And are there any useful examples in that process, or is it just apples and oranges? Again, those were poor people that were looking for jobs elsewhere. And so you had this sort of fleeing of the Midwest. Do you sense any sort of parallels there?
I think it's early days for the big noticeable waves of demographic change that I would anticipate. But a lot of people that I talk to point to the Rust Belt as a place with inherent opportunity because of this kind of change, right? Because these are places that peaked their populations with the decline of industry in the 19th and in theory, at least have excess capacity now, have infrastructure and roads and build housing stock, not to mention a climate that can support that growth in the future. And there are some kind of early indicator trend lines. In terms of agriculture, the cost of land is increasing sharply in the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes region. Places like Wisconsin and Michigan are seeing heavy land investment and a shift in farming into those regions. And in the cities, it's really hard to tell, but the Inflation Reduction Act has pumped money, subsidies for the auto industry, for example, into Michigan. You see a lot of tech investment in other parts of the Northeast, even in Montreal, different country, obviously, but climatically a similar region. And so there's sort of early signs of hope and willing to invest and the perception of opportunity in those regions. But I think it's going to take, this is the kind of thing might take us a decade or two to see it begin to play out.
I know this will be hard, but within your book, obviously talk to a lot of different people. Maybe you could just give us one example of someone on the ground. I think there were some great examples of wildfire in California and just people living with that impact. But could you just share someone that you talked to and their experiences and the decisions they have to make?
Yeah, I start the book and I end the book with the story of this woman, Ellen Hurdell. And Ellen lives near me in Northern California. She's about an hour north of San Francisco. And she's lived in California her whole life, as has her husband. And their roots, their family is very much tied to here. And she is an example of someone who's lived with this burden of growing wildfire risk and the impacts of that successively over the last bunch of years. And it's changed the way she thinks about her sense of home. Her in-laws lost their home in a wildfire in Sonoma County 15. And then in 2016, 17, 18, and 19, there were successive wildfires in her area, some of which had her routinely evacuating from her home. In the middle of the night, she tells me these stories of pre-packed crates of belongings and family photo albums in the garage ready to go, but trying to hustle the cats into the cat crates and get her young children out of bed and all loaded in the car so they can race down the hill and away from the wildfire front line as fire trucks are racing up the hill. And that is the kind of experience that she began to have repeatedly, and it began to traumatize her children, who saw friends lose their homes, while Ellen didn't ever lose her home, thankfully, but some of their neighbors did. And even just that traumatic experience of having to wake up in the middle of the night and get out of the house for children was especially difficult. And so this begins to weigh on her, and she begins to rethink whether she can remain in the state of California. And she's an example of somebody who never planned to move, didn't have great ambitions to move, but is suddenly forced by the environment changing around her to rethink everything that was normal and stable.
Okay. Have you heard any updates? Is she still there?
She is still in California, as am I. I have a very similar kind of experience. So I think this is emblematic of the difficulty and the lack of an obvious prescriptive answer to this dilemma. She's unsettled. She recognizes she now lives in an era of rapid change, that she can't necessarily predict her future, but she hasn't chosen to uproot everything and to leave yet. She's made some adjustments in her life, like renting instead of owning a property, for example, that give her the flexibility to make a change. She talks about maybe the future is a nomadic kind of future. Maybe living in California and among her community is a seasonal experience instead of a full-time experience. She doesn't really know. She's open to what the future brings in terms of disruption and change, and hasn't arrived at the other end of that transformation yet.
I just recently had Bill Weir from CNN. He's their climate person there. And he did a story about a woman living in California. It was a wildfire one. And it was the opposite. She just came in and wanted to rebuild everything. And she did. She was able to it was a big ordeal, but she wanted to stay and she was committed to this community and such. And I play the devil's advocate. I was like, well, maybe she shouldn't have done that. Maybe she shouldn't be moving back and rebuilding in these areas. And Bill acknowledged that and led to an interesting conversation. And I know these are very difficult. It's hard to leave your community, but at some stage, like what you're even proposing in the book, is just the government needs to step in and just make sure that people are not living in these areas that are such high risk and going to be at higher risk.
Yeah, I think the dilemma is different depending on the region and what catastrophe you're potentially facing. And wildfire is a different threat from sea level rise, for example. But I spent some time in Louisiana in a community that's similar to what you're describing, and with this one woman in particular, Colette Pichon Battle. And she's a lawyer. She grew up in a town called Slidell, Louisiana. It was just north of New Orleans. And her family had been in that community for hundreds of years, back into the 1700s. And she tells me this story of she's living and working in Washington, D.C. when Hurricane Katrina strikes and devastates Slidell, Louisiana. And rather than moving away, she moves home. And she has that sort of sense of resilience. Like, the risk is, in her view, everybody's going to leave. And so she's going to come back and she's going to help this place rebuild. And she spends the better part of the 20 years between then and now working towards that, like rebuilding Slidell, Louisiana, building resiliency, building awareness about climate change, and basically fighting migration because she wants to see this community survive. And throughout that process, she has this growing realization of what sea level rise means on the Louisiana coast. And that's different from wildfire, where you can't really, you're not going to live underwater. One day that water is going to come. And you look at those maps and she sees the loss of land if it's outside of protected levees. And there's this kind of inevitableness to that change. And that's a different kind of a battle. And people are being forced to retreat from coastal Louisiana. And there are early government programs that are taking some of those communities and resettling them a little bit further away. And those are some of the types of stories that I explore in the book.
I actually spoke with her. It's been a while. I did a visit of that Louisiana area, and I had her on. It's fantastic. I want to pivot a little bit here, and you mentioned a bit earlier. Rhodium. What's the group you're working with?
Rhodium Group, the economic and environmental research firm that has an office here in Oakland, California.
You are a climate journalist. You're not a climate modeler. And so I'm focusing on this more on my podcast, talking about all these private firms that are coming in and using publicly available climate data, but then they're creating their own tools and such with it. So it's a really big issue. And I'm just curious, you work with them. Do you have a sense of they're generating these projections, these models, and these maps based on climate data? Were you able to even have a conversation like how they get it? And to me, this is a perfect example. This is a really good use of it, but are they using it the right way? Did you even have, I don't know if you have the technical skills, but this is increasingly going to be an issue because more groups are coming in and doing climate modeling.
Yeah, you bet. It's a great question. And we had extensive conversations and dialogue around this issue. And I would just say that part of the reason I chose to work with them and part of the reason they allowed me to use their data is because we both, wanted to take a very conservative approach to painting a picture of the future when there's great uncertainty about that future. I don't have the technical expertise to get deep into the modeling, except to say that I steered away from, in the reporting about the United States, like a gravity-centered model that tries to both predict where people will go or predict human behavior, because I think that's incredibly difficult to do, but also to get too granular about where these effects would impact. So I did map, and I'll describe that a little bit, down to the county level, but do not, and don't think that it's quite possible to down to the city block level, for example, which a lot of for-profit climate data firms are trying to say that they can do. So Rhodium is quite conservative in their research. They also partner with and run a thing called the Climate Impact Lab. And they do this in partnership with a number of universities, including Rutgers and the University of California, Berkeley. So their research is really top notch. And what they delivered to me was a body of forecasts about specific climate perils, decoupled from assumptions about what the reaction to those perils might be, if that makes any sense. So they're not projecting migration in response to wildfires, but they can help me project change in wildfire patterns. And the same with rising temperatures, or the same with, economic impacts that they model on a county level basis across the country from climate impacts. So all of their work is derived from, a lot of it is, the same public data sources, measurements for things like heat and weather, but then also peer-reviewed, journal-published modeling and interpretations of the economics. And it came with some conditions, like that I represent each of those perils separately, and that I should and did, and also agree with the notion of representing RCP 4.5 as well as RCP 8.5, so that we're not just having a conversation about the worst case extreme scenarios that might be highly unlikely, but actually having a conversation about near term, far more plausible climate outcomes. Overall, that all those things combined to say that I picked data and partnered with them in a way that I think presents a conservative and very plausible picture and tries not to overstate what we can know and the severity of the long-term picture.
And I just encourage you as a climate journalist, that's an area that I would like more of you guys to pick around. But the First Street Foundation is getting, they have a lot of corporate clients and such, but there's a lot of small time clients out there, local governments and such, that are going to be using these tools. The name of my episode is The Wild West of Climate Modeling, and that's what's happening out there. So I'm just encouraging you as a journalist. I hope it's something you maybe will poke around in and see there's a story there.
Yeah, for sure. And I know that debate a little bit. And it's part of why I chose the what I believe is a more conservative path that I did in this reporting.
This will be a fun question. So think about the consequences to the electoral map when blue coastal population areas move inland to these red areas, these red states. What do you think? I have red Southerners who might move north to blue states. Do you speculate like how that might influence things?
Yeah, so not with any kind of certainty or any kind of forecasted outcome. I think all we can say about that is that we all can anticipate an era of great change, and I think it'll scramble the map. It's hard to know when that'll happen, when there's a tipping point, both in terms of people moving or what that means for politics. But I think that all that I could say about that is that I wouldn't be surprised if 25 years from now, the electoral map looks entirely different from how it does today, in part in response to the kind of changes that I write about and that you just described.
I guess I would hate seeing where you might change the politics in areas that it's obvious that it's climate change that's impacting, people are having to move, and yet we still have climate denial 25 years from now, and those politics influence our ability to fund adaptation. I could just seeing the movement of people actually making it harder to create better policies to deal with that movement. So it could go that direction.
Yeah, I think that could cut both ways. Part of my thinking in trying to write this book the way I do is that it could be a tool for people of all kind of political persuasions to recognize what's happening in their communities and what's happening around them. Some of the communities affected by wildfire in Northern California are not liberal at all, quite conservative even, have strong opinions about things like forest management and whether it's climate change that's causing their vulnerability or whether that's a second order impact. But it doesn't matter if you're being evacuated and you can't get insurance and the economics of your savings and your retirement fund are changing completely. What matters is what you do next in response to that. I think the movement is going to be bipartisan and that to some degree helping people understand what those forces are that are changing their economy and changing the risk profile of their communities is really important. And some people will buy that. Some people might remain resistant to it because they deny the science of climate change. But I think that there's a sweet spot to communicate with people about change that doesn't have to trigger all of those controversial terms and denialism.
Your book mainly focuses on people, but where does ecological and environmental migration fit into this? That they're going to be having their own struggles and those things are going to be happening in parallel. Did you really address that much at all?
It wasn't a focus of my reporting, and it's not a focus of the narrative that resulted, except to say that, well, there's big picture, this idea of this human habitability niche. And that is basically an ecosystem study of the world. And it finds that humans, but also other living creatures have had a sweet spot, the right range of temperature and precipitation for thousands of years that has been hospitable to life and to human life in particular. And that's what's shifting with climate change. It's moving towards the poles. And because the land masses in the developed world are more northerly, that generally means it's going to shift human habitat northward. And in the United States, that also is going to shift that sweet spot towards the Canadian border and towards the upper Midwest. And that's where I expect people to go. But you see some of the ecological shift in other ways, a little bit reflected in my data about projected crop yields, for example, which would say that in South Texas, industrial crops like corn and soy might be completely wiped out, decline by 90%. And in the high plains, it might be decreased by 30 or 40%. But in North Dakota, they might increase by 5 to 10%. And so that's a reflection of this sort of ecological shift, or the same in the shift of wine growing regions, where I mentioned in the book how wines in Northern California are getting sweeter, the temperature is increasing, the spring is coming sooner, the moisture is changing. But New Cabernets are going to be increasingly grown in parts of Oregon that were Pinot country before. And you're seeing this sort of shift northward in that sense as well.
You'll probably enjoy this question too. Is I have a lot of listeners who do on the ground adaptation. They're adaptation professionals, and many of them live and are doing their jobs in an area that you would say are at risk. That in your book that you identify coastal areas in California. My question to you: are they wasting their time? Should they move and encourage their neighbors to move?
No. Are they wasting their time? No, I don't think anybody who's working in this space is wasting their time. And there's so much work to do. And all of that work is so valuable and so important, even if it means working out of the University of Miami or Tulane or in Chico, California, or whatever the case may be. One of the patterns around human migration and climate migration in general isn't that people completely evacuate in an absolutist sense out of a region, or at least that I don't think that's what's going to happen in the United States. But it might mean a rapid urbanization and that rural communities have a difficult time sustaining themselves because they don't have the infrastructure or the support network or a tax base to keep them resilient or shield individual people from environmental impacts, but that those people can find some of that collective resilience by moving to their closest urban area. Maybe rural Arizona kind of hollows out, but Phoenix continues to grow, for example. And different regions face different kinds of threats. Miami's going to have a really hard time fending off rising waters a half century from now. But whether we can live with heat and drought in an urbanized area, those places might have a long and prosperous future ahead of them. And certainly like living in them and working to defend them and make them more resilient is good and important work.
You have recommendations in the book, but what's your sense on how the federal government's doing and even some state governments in regards to things that will help with, you have recommendations, and we have the Infrastructure Act that has money that's dedicated toward resilience. Do you feel like pieces are moving into place? Are we even heading in the right direction? Do you follow the federal adaptation policy like that?
Yeah, not expert in it, but I follow it a little. I'm very heartened by the legislations of the last couple of years, including the Inflation Reduction Act, right? It's some of the most substantial change policy shifts that we've seen in my lifetime, and very much in the direction that's needed. I think it remains to be seen whether it's enough. It's almost certainly not, but it's a hopeful start, and it gives me some hope that action can be taken and work can be done. On a local level, on a municipal level, my experience through my reporting is that it's kind of early days in terms of migration in particular, a little less so in terms of making communities defensible against environmental change. But in terms of planning for demographic change, it's really early days. And that places are starting to have these conversations, places like Detroit or Ann Arbor, Michigan, but that we haven't seen a lot of like concrete, tangible results from that yet. And what I hear most, and this is a mushy little thing, but what I hear a lot of policymakers describe or express the need for is a breaking down of silos at all levels of government, local, state, federal, which is just the need for health departments to talk to parks departments or to talk to water departments in crafting long-term development plans for cities, as opposed to operating in their unique silos of complying with whatever their respective environmental regulations are, but not considering how they interact to make a place more livable or habitable for a growing population or a shrinking population in the future. So I think that there's a future need for more nuance and more complexity and more cross-discipline engagement that we're not quite seeing yet at a policymaking level.
Okay, so as a journalist, you obviously have resources and experts that you tap into. And I've asked this question before to other journalists, is that when we read these climate impact stories, a lot of times you're talking to that person on the ground that's impacted, a homeowner and such, but do you have your own names of what I would call adaptation professionals that really understand the issue of doing adaptation planning? Because sometimes I don't think a lot of journalists quite get that there's an adaptation sector. It's its own emerging sector. Do you have a group of people that you tap into?
Yeah, I report deeply and for a long time on any project that I dive into, and this one's no different. And so that includes a range of academics and professionals, and sometimes it's the same people, like Jesse Keenan was an old go-to of mine who's been incredibly influential in shaping the way I think. But sometimes as different projects evolve, it's more one-off. I read the journals. I contact the authors of those journals. I talk to the city governments and talk to their sustainability departments and figure out who's doing the work and have those conversations.
All right, great. And speaking of Jesse Keenan, who's a big part of this podcast, you had a conversation with him, and I think I like the quote I was reading. You asked him a question about selling your house, and he had a response. Tell me how that all unfolded. What was that?
Well, Jesse Wells, he's an emphatic person at times. But in that particular moment, Jesse was educating me on the potential for spiraling economic decline. And I think we were talking about a phenomenon that he describes as blue lining, which is the risk that you can have, in this case, in California, heightened wildfire risk in a suburban neighborhood that can begin to undermine the market value of homes, either because insurers won't insure them or banks don't want to lend on them. And that at some point that kind of spirals into an infectious contagion just among the community itself for less rational purposes that becomes really hard to measure. So we're having this kind of scary conversation about the economics of home values in California. And then that particular day, I was looking out my window into the wildland urban interface in the suburban place that I live in. And I was like, hey, wait, Jesse, I live right in one of these spots you're describing. Should I? And he just cut me off and presumed my question was, should I move? And he was like, yes, get out of there. You got to go. That was three or 4 years ago, and I haven't moved yet. Take it with a grain of salt. But yeah.
Jesse's not one to tiptoe around almost any topic or conversation. That's good advice. I don't know if it's practical advice, but good advice in the big picture of what you're saying here.
Yeah, you bet.
So how do you think the media is doing covering the issue of climate migration?
I'm happy to see that climate migration has become significantly covered. That wasn't the case a couple of years ago. I think it's hit or miss. I think the media is not monolithic and it's hard to characterize it in general. I like to say, for a long time, I've argued as a reporter that I wish that all of my colleagues covering everything that journalists cover, from education to economics, were thinking about climate change as part of the beats and as part of the issues that they cover, that this isn't a siloed beat to cover climate change, that really it affects everything. And that's how I think of climate migration now as well. When I look at the United States and the scope of changes, that my book tries to pinpoint or forecast, I think that in some way, climate-driven migration is going to affect everything from urban planning to agricultural policy to the cost of energy generation to, poverty reduction plans and on. And so I would like to see journalists thinking about what kind of climate-related demographic change might be in the background or might be a subtle signal in whatever story that they're reporting, even if they're not climate reporters or they're not reporting explicitly on climate-driven migration. I don't quite see that happening yet, but I do see an increasing both understanding and acknowledgement of the fact that climate change is changing the habitability of certain regions. We've seen extensive projects from our big national newspapers around sea level rise and flooding in urban areas lately. I think the Washington Post is in the middle of one of those series right now. I see that as climate migration related and doing a good job. I think the danger is that if you oversimplify it, then the knee-jerk reaction is to portray migration as something bad or scary, or if it's international migration as something particularly challenging that has a lot of political implications. And so there's a lot of landmines to watch out for also. But overall, I think it's an improving space.
Great. You've got this new book out, and I'm not quite sure if you're doing a book tour, but you're doing some promotion of it. So I'm just going to call it a book tour, whatever that form that might take. But how's that going?
It's going great. I'm getting around a little bit. I've been on the road and in some bookstores and a lot online as well. Reception's been really positive. People are really fascinated to learn more about this. And also, I think, just drawn to seeing the specific regional projections that I discussed in the book to really get a sense of, if you live on the coast of North Carolina, what are the changes that you can expect in those communities, and to connect it with these larger forecasts of large scale demographic change. So I don't know. People are psyched. I don't think climate books are blockbusters, and mine isn't either, but I'm really pleased with the interest and the feedback that I'm getting.
Well, I think it's always interesting when you get out to the public with these topics. Any interesting questions that you didn't see coming, like any surprises, like really stood out?
I think that how would I jump? Two things that surprised me a little bit through the course of reporting. The first probably shouldn't have been a surprise, but it is just the great inequality with which the burden of climate change is going to fall on American communities. And it's really striking to begin to see how much less capable, say, like impoverished inner LA communities that have no tree cover and no parkland for respite from the heat will fare against rising temperatures in California compared to leafy, wealthy Beverly Hills communities, for example. And I think we see that whether it's New Orleans or across Louisiana, Mississippi, et cetera, just the great inequality is really striking to me. And the flip side of that conversation, also surprising to me, is not only opportunity that might exist for a lot of parts of the country, but the extent to which people, investors, industries are trying to look around the curve and spot that opportunity speculatively and game it, maybe invest in it. Rising land prices in Wisconsin or in Michigan, for example, agricultural shifts of potato farming in that region, or even what that means for the hotel industry in places like Detroit. I think that's exciting. A lot of people are really thinking about that a lot more. When I began this project, I was thinking of it a lot more as a portrait of catastrophe, but there's this whole other side of the equation.
Are there any stories that you're working on that you can share with us?
Only to be opaque about it. One of the things when in my reporting about climate-driven migration globally has been my increased understanding of the great conflict that will result from it in so many places and the potential for more conflict. And it's really a dark underbelly, I think, of climate change and how it's affecting societies. And so I'm working on a project now exploring what that means inside the United States, where those climate pressures are increasing societal frictions and what that might mean.
Very interesting. I ask all my guests, and keep in mind this is a climate adaptation podcast, if you could recommend anyone to come on as a guest on the show, who would it be?
Oh, geez. She's in my book. I had great conversations throughout my reporting with a woman named Beth Gibbons, and she's a planner who, at the time I was reporting the book, was the executive director of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, which is a group that was thinking about how Great Lakes communities might proactively prepare for climate-driven migration. She's now with a firm called the Farallon Group, but doing similar work, and she's just a really fascinating thinker about some of these issues.
Oh, Beth. I know Beth. Yeah, she was one of my original 4. She was on 7 years ago when she was at ASAP and stuff. That's funny.
Great.
Yeah,
you're great. Ahead of me.
Well, no, it's good. It's great that she's out there and being a resource to you. And obviously, yeah, she was at the center of ASAP for a while there. And so that's just funny, though, that you're recommending someone who's been on before. And Beth, if you are listening, there you go. Recommendation to come on the podcast. Again, congratulations on the book. Very important subject. Sounds like you're going to be in the thick of it for a while, and appreciate all that you do. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for your interest. Appreciate the conversation.
Okay, Adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to Abrahm for coming on the podcast. Definitely check out his book, On the Move. Links are in my show notes. It's a huge issue and only going to increase in importance. I've covered managed retreat quite a bit, but they aren't necessarily the same issue. In theory, managed retreat is somewhat managed, but climate migration will be at times a free-for-all. But that doesn't mean we can't start prepping. And Abraham's book is a primer on what the stakes are in areas of the country likely to be on the move first. Definitely have a read. Okay, as I noted in the introduction, I'm going to start offering a hot take for each episode. Yes, I know this isn't an original idea, but I was at a conference recently talking with a listener, and they suggested I do a hot take for the podcast. Hey, it's fun and easy enough to do. For those who aren't familiar, and I looked up a definition, and there are many, a hot take is usually a controversial opinion that has no factually right or wrong answer. It's a knee-jerk response to an issue. My hot take for this climate migration episode is that as the U.S. population begins to move northward due to rising temperatures, we're going to overrun Canada. At some point, Canada and the United States will merge into one mega country because there will be so many climate migrants from the U.S. streaming into our northern neighbor. I know that sounds awful to some people. Listen, this won't happen overnight. And I'm sorry, my Canadian listeners, not that I'm saying I want this to happen. This is my hot take. Feel free to email me with your hot take for this topic. Okay, Adapters, imagine the potential of showcasing your achievements through a widely acclaimed podcast that boasts a large network of climate and adaptation professionals. Yes, I'm talking about America Adapts, and how it offers your company or organization the perfect platform to tell your adaptation story and spread your message to a diverse and highly influential audience of climate professionals. By sponsoring a whole episode, you not only have a chance to share your story with the world, but also integrate a podcast episode into your organization's long-term communication strategy. It's time to expand beyond the confines of webinars and white papers, which can be dry and forgettable. Let's work together closely to identify the experts who best represent the remarkable work your organization is undertaking in adaptation through the power of podcast storytelling. It's also a great chance to highlight your partners. This will not only enable effective communication with your members, board members, and funders, but also leave a lasting impact. The value of podcasts lies in their ability to continue promoting your story long after their initial release, ensuring it remains a critical educational resource for years to come. I am humbled to have collaborated with prestigious partners such as Battelle, the Department of Defense, NRDC, University of Pennsylvania at Wharton, World Wildlife Fund, UCLA, Harvard University, the Trustee of Reservations, and many more. So let's add your organization to this esteemed list. Yes, we can make a significant difference in the world of climate change adaptation. To learn more about the Enduring Value podcast and how they can benefit your company or organization, email me at americadapps@gmail.com. Also, if you're interested in having me speak at a public or corporate event, please reach out. I've been doing some keynote presentations. It's been a very active spring for me. I've been to New Jersey, going in New York City, going to Washington, D.C., speaking, doing keynote presentations and sitting on panels and moderating panels. I share stories from the podcast and my own experiences in adaptation. It's also a pep talk about what we're all doing here. These are sobering times, but also very exciting times in the adaptation field. It's such a new emerging area that you can influence the field. Let me help educate your audience on this emerging adaptation sector and how it differs from carbon mitigation and sustainability. Your companies and organizations, and especially your leadership, need to understand these differences in the years ahead. You can contact me at americadapps@gmail.com. Okay, adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.